Do you think you know the story of Anne Boleyn, the famous queen beheaded by Henry VIII? Get ready to discover that the truth is far darker and more disturbing than any history book dared to tell. Anne's execution was not a simple act of justice. It was a masterpiece of psychological terror, public humiliation, and political manipulation. During her final days, Anne faced isolation, sleep deprivation, and brutal interrogations, subjected to a systematic campaign designed to destroy her mind even before the blade touched her. Henry VIII, obsessed with absolute control, went beyond the physical and destroyed her identity, spreading absurd accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king, turning her reputation and even her daughter Elizabeth into tools of political propaganda. On the day of the execution, nothing was left to chance. Blindfolded, knelt upright, faced a foreign executioner she had never met, and her death was transformed into a public spectacle, each detail carefully calculated to humiliate and terrorize, while the crowd was manipulated to believe everything was just and necessary. Even after her death, her head and body were hastily buried in an improvised box without proper ritual, and the king quickly moved on with his political plans, showing just how disposable Anne had become. And the most shocking part? Reports indicate she may have remained conscious for seconds after the decapitation, a detail omitted by official history. What amazes me most is how a queen, so powerful and admired, could be subjected to such a meticulous process of physical, mental, and symbolic destruction, turning her death into a brutal lesson on absolute power. If you truly want to understand the full horror of Anne Boleyn's execution, you need to watch this video until the end, because the final revelation will impact you in ways you never imagined. And don't forget to subscribe and leave your like right now, because your subscription is essential for YouTube to know you want to see more shocking and intriguing content like this, helping the channel grow and continue bringing stories that challenge what you think you know about the past. The idea that Anne Boleyn may have remained conscious for up to 30 seconds after her beheading is one of the most disturbing and rarely discussed aspects of her execution. Although it may sound like something out of a horror movie, there is a physiological basis for this phenomenon. When the head is separated from the body, the brain can still receive residual oxygen from the bloodstream, which may allow basic senses like sight and hearing to continue functioning for a few seconds, along with the ability to move the lips or even form sound. Imagine, for a moment, the experience of someone fully aware of everything around them, but unable to act, knowing that life is slipping away rapidly. It is both fascinating and terrifying. In Anne's case, Queen of England, this possibility adds a darker dimension to the historical narrative, because the execution of a monarch was not only an act of justice, but a carefully orchestrated political and psychological performance. During these final seconds, it was not just about physical pain, but the consciousness of lost status, fear of the unknown, and the impact her death would have on those around her. Contemporary witnesses reported details such as involuntary movements of her eyes and lips, giving the impression that Anne might have been trying to continue her prayers or communicate something, even after her head had been severed from her body. Historically, this aspect is often omitted, softened, or transformed into a more dignified narrative to avoid shocking readers and maintain the image of a formal, swift execution. However, understanding this reality brings us closer to the human experience she endured and makes us reflect on the cruelty of Tudor justice, which spared not even the most grotesque details in pursuit of political objective. Knowing that Anne may have had a brief moment of awareness after her decapitation adds a layer of tragedy and humanity to her fate, showing that beyond being a judged, condemned queen, she was a woman subjected to a system that turned death and suffering into spectacle. It reminds us that historical accounts often conceal the intensity of personal experience behind official facts. This dimension of the event challenges our romanticized or simplified perception of history, revealing how science, physiology, and political narrative intersect to expose the true gravity of what Anne Boleyn faced in her final seconds. Even before her execution, Anne Boleyn endured a form of torture far crueler than the beheading itself, psychological. For weeks, she was subjected to an environment designed to break her mind and will, where every detail of her imprisonment was used as a weapon against her sanity. Anne spent days confined in the Tower of London, in a mix of solitude and constant surveillance, with no meaningful contact with and deprived of any routine that could provide comfort. The prolonged isolation provoked not only fear, but also a sense of unreality, as if she were in limbo, separated from the world she once knew as queen. Sleep deprivation was deliberately used as a tool of disorientation. Nights without rest, disturbed by anxiety and uncertainty, undermined her ability to maintain mental clarity and emotional balance. Her execution was repeatedly postponed, each delay increasing tension and despair, forcing Anne to live in a constant state of anticipating horror, never knowing exactly when her life would end. This cruel technique of psychological manipulation aimed to generate a mixture of terror, confusion, and despair, a form of absolute control over the mind of someone who once held power and prestige. Each day, she reportedly heard rumors and grotesque accusations, including false stories of treason, adultery, and conspiracies to kill the king, all carefully fabricated to erode her confidence, dignity, and reputation. Even under this pressure, Anne displayed a silent courage, maintaining apparent composure and even dark humor in her final moments, which, from a modern psychological, could be interpreted as dissociation, a mental defense mechanism that allows one to endure extreme trauma. The king and his advisors' intent was clear, not only to eliminate the queen physically, but to destroy her as a person, corroding her identity and making her death seem inevitable and justified in the eyes of the public. This psychological preparation transformed the execution into something far beyond an act of physical violence, becoming a complete experience of humiliation, fear, and mental control. Anne's mind was tested to its limit, and the brutality of this silent torture reveals how cruel and calculating the Tudor power system was, where psychological pain was as strategic as the sword that would eventually end her life. This dimension of her story brings us closer to the human experience she endured, allowing us to understand that Anne Boleyn's execution was not merely a historical event, but a shocking study of power, manipulation, and psychological suffering. The execution of Anne Boleyn was far more than a simple act of justice. It was a meticulously staged spectacle in which politics and theater merged to create a demonstration of absolute power. Henry VIII turned the death of his second wife into a public performance, manipulating every detail to send a clear message to anyone who might dare challenge him. To ensure a quick and precise beheading, he hired a specialized French swordsman instead of using the traditional English axe. Although often presented as a gesture of mercy, this choice primarily revealed the theatricality of the presence of a foreigner amplified the visual impact for spectators and emphasized the king's absolute control over every aspect of the event, minimizing any risk of failure. The execution platform itself, low and close to the crowd at Tower Green, was designed to expose Anne vulnerably, diminishing her dignity and turning every movement she made, from kneeling posture to silent prayers, into part of a carefully orchestrated scene. The environment was not solemn. It was designed to create tension, fear, and humiliation, with guards, choir boys, and spectators positioned to amplify the dramatic effect. Every detail of the execution served as political propaganda. Beyond physically eliminating the queen, it reinforced the narrative that her downfall was inevitable and justified, shaping public opinion and consolidating Henry VIII's power. The meticulous preparation, including the swordsman's rehearsals, the choice of a foreign blade, and the manipulation of the crowd, turned her death into an event of almost artistic precision, yet filled with brutality and psychological significance. Thus, Anne Boleyn's execution not only served the practical need to remove an unwanted queen, but also became a tool for controlling narrative, memory, and public perception. Every gesture, every detail was designed to send a lasting message. Before the king, not even a queen could escape the monarch's absolute authority. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not merely a physical act to remove a queen, but a carefully orchestrated operation to erase her identity, undermine her influence, and rewrite her history. Henry VIII did not just want Anne dead. He sought to destroy everything she represented, erasing her political, social, and even familial significance. In the days leading up to her execution, Anne was subjected to a campaign of defamation with absurd accusations of adultery, incest, and conspiracy against the king deliberately fabricated to discredit her reputation and publicly justify her elimination. Every detail of her imprisonment, interrogation, and trial was manipulated to corrode her dignity and confidence, creating a narrative that portrayed her as a morally corrupt woman, even when there was no plausible evidence. The manipulation extended beyond Anne herself. Her daughter Elizabeth, still a child, was declared illegitimate and removed from the line of succession, a cruel blow intended to invalidate the girl's future right to inherit the throne. By attacking her daughter, Henry ensured that the impact of Anne's execution would reach beyond her body, affecting her legacy and lineage. Moreover, after the queen's death, portraits were destroyed, royal emblems erased, and any mention of her name was discouraged at court, as if Henry were attempting to literally wipe her from collective. Even the act of execution, which might be seen as a form of justice, was imbued with symbolic messaging. The use of a French swordsman, the low platform, the public exposure, and the absolute control over what the audience could see or hear transformed her death into a display of power, reinforcing the narrative that Anne was guilty and her disappearance inevitable. This systematic process of character assassination, historical manipulation, and the nullification of her daughter's rights is an early example of state-sanctioned reputation murder, showing how Tudor politics used death not only to eliminate rivals, but to reshape memory and public perception. The tragedy of Anne Boleyn, therefore, lies not only in the end of her life, but in the calculated attempt to erase everything she was, from her personal and political achievements to the very legitimacy of her lineage, making clear that, for Henry VIII, absolute power included not only controlling bodies, but also controlling history, erasing legacies. In the final moments before her execution, Anne Boleyn displayed a silent courage and remarkable composure that reveal both her psychological strength and the complexity of her situation. Even facing the imminence of brutal death, she managed to maintain calm and controlled behavior, exhibiting what modern historians might identify as dissociation, a mental defense mechanism that allows an individual to emotionally separate from extreme trauma in order to endure it. Witnesses reported that Anne even made jokes about her own death, referring to herself with dark humor, known as gallows, a type of jest that arises in situations of extreme danger and fear, as a way to preserve sanity. This attitude was not merely a display of personal bravery, but also a form of subtle resistance. Even under intense public scrutiny, she managed to challenge the narrative of guilt that Henry VIII and his allies had constructed, demonstrating that her dignity and intelligence remained intact despite humiliation and suffering. During her final hours, Anne was acutely aware that every gesture, word, and expression would be observed and remembered, and she used this to her advantage, balancing care and subtlety to avoid compromising her daughter Elizabeth's position. Her final speech, formal and measured, appeared submissive to the law, but in reality, it was an act of calculated defiance, acknowledging the king's authority without admitting guilt, maintaining her moral and political integrity before an audience manipulated to see her as criminal. Kneeling at the moment of execution, she continued to pray and move her lips, striving to maintain spiritual presence and connection to her faith while accepting the inevitable. Every gesture, from the contained smile to the outward calm, functioned as a form of silent communication, a message of resistance, intelligence, and humanity that transcended the oppression around. The combination of dark humor, self-control, and strategic attention to the impact of her actions on her daughter's future reveals that Anne was not merely a passive victim of state violence, but a woman profoundly aware of her legacy and determined to preserve it, even under the most extreme conditions. These final moments of Anne Boleyn remain one of the most striking examples of how courage, intelligence, and resilience can manifest in the face of injustice and threats to life, offering a poignant and human perspective on her tragedy that goes far beyond the stroke of the sword. Anne Boleyn's execution was marked by carefully planned methods that emphasized technique and precision over compassion, transforming the act of taking her life into an almost mechanical challenge, devoid of humanity. To begin with, she was blindfolded, a gesture often interpreted as an attempt to spare her from seeing the blade. But in practice, it served other strategic purposes. The blindfold prevented Anne from moving or reacting at the last moment, ensuring that the French executioner could carry out his work with absolute precision, without interruptions or complications that might ruin the spectacle. Additionally, Anne was forced to kneel in the traditional French position, remaining upright rather than resting her head on a block, increasing the difficulty for the executioner and highlighting the calculated nature. This posture demanded extreme control over her body, her breathing, and her anxiety, turning every second into a test of discipline and mental strength while the audience watched closely. The choice of a highly trained foreign swordsman instead of the customary English executioner with an axe added even more coldness to the process. The executioner was a professional hired specifically to perform a clean and efficient beheading, minimizing any risk of error and removing the human, imperfect element that typically accompanies capital punishment. In this way, the execution ceased to be merely the death of a person and became a technical, almost surgical procedure, where Anne's suffering was secondary to the precision of the act and the impression it would leave on the public. Every detail, from the blindfold to the precise movements, from the use of a foreign sword to the required posture, reinforced the idea that Anne was not treated as a queen or human being, but as an object within a political and theatrical plan. At the same time, this dehumanization intensified the psychological impact, as Anne was aware of everything around her, but had limited control over her fate, facing an executioner who did not know her personally and whose sole function was to complete a technical task. This combination of circumstances shows that Anne Boleyn's execution was far more than a simple act of justice. It was a display of power, a method of controlling the narrative, and a demonstration that, under the king's authority, even a queen could be reduced to a technical challenge, deprived of dignity, and treated as an instrument of spectacle. Ultimately, the manner of her death reveals the complexity of Tudor cruelty, where death was meticulously planned to impress, terrorize, and erase the humanity of those who fell from grace, turning a moment that could have been personal and intimate into an event of politics and after the beheading, Anne Boleyn's situation continued to reflect absolute disregard for her dignity and humanity, demonstrating that the cruelty of her execution did not end with the fall of contrary to what one might expect for a queen. Her body and head did not receive the proper care for a dignified burial. Instead, her attendants, in deep shock and terror, had to improvise quickly, placing the remains in an arrow chest, an object entirely unsuitable for someone of her status. There was no preparation of an appropriate tomb, nor a complete Christian ceremony, which was customary even for nobles executed for treason, reflecting the clear intent to hasten the process and treat Anne more as a political problem to be discarded than as a human being to be respected. This haste and lack of protocol explicitly illustrate how deeply Henry VIII and his regime were committed to erasing not only Anne's life, but also any visible mark of her physical and symbolic ignorance. The burial site remained unmarked, hidden among other executed nobles' bodies, turning her death into anonymity and erasing her presence from the immediate history of even her attendants, who performed the painful task of handling and covering the body, suffered profound trauma, with some carrying nightmares for the rest of their lives, and others withdrawing from court life to avoid associations with the tragedy they had witnessed. The absence of proper ritual, wake, or any formal sign of mourning not only disrespected Anne's memory, but also reinforced the political message that she was to be forgotten, her reputation nullified, and her existence reduced to an insignificant. This negligence, far from being an administrative oversight, functioned as a continuation of the humiliation initiated during her imprisonment and trial, consolidating Henry VIII's strategy of turning his queen's death into an instrument of control and intimidation, showing that even in death, Anne's body belonged to the state and was subject to the king's will. The indignity of the burial, the disregard for Christian ritual, and the attempt to erase her physical presence reflect a cruelty that transcends the execution itself, exposing how Tudor politics could manipulate not only life, but also a person's memory and legacy, turning a death that could have been solemn into an act of dehumanization and erasure. This reality helps us understand that Anne Boleyn's tragedy did not end with it extended to how her body and her story were treated, a grim reminder of absolute power and the coldness with which it could be exercised. The execution of Anne Boleyn was not merely an act of physical violence and personal humiliation, but also a masterful exercise in manipulating public perception, where Henry VIII and his court transformed the death of a queen to a carefully staged moral and political lesson. The king's propaganda sought to present the execution as an act of mercy and justice, emphasizing details such as the hiring of a highly skilled French swordsman capable of performing a swift and clean decapitation, as if this were a gesture of consideration toward Anne, when in reality, it served to reinforce the theatricality and control of the narrative. The public, both those present at the Tower of London and those who heard about the events through official accounts, was carefully prepared to interpret the execution as a warning about the consequences of challenging the monarch's power, especially in the case of women who dared to exceed their social or political positions. Every gesture of Anne, every word of her final speech, and every detail of the execution was recorded and transmitted in a way that reinforced the official version that she was guilty and that her death was inevitable and justified. At the same time, the crowd was manipulated to react in a controlled manner, with planted supporters applauding and expressing approval, creating an atmosphere of public consent, even when the true feelings of the people may have been far more complex. This form of political propaganda not only shaped the immediate perception of the execution, but also initiated a process of censorship and historical rewriting, erasing Anne's human experience and replacing it with a narrative that favored the king's interests. The psychological impact of this manipulation was profound, By seeing or hearing about the execution, citizens were conditioned to associate absolute power with divine justice and political effectiveness, internalizing the idea that any opposition to the king would be swiftly corrected, leaving no room for moral questioning or empathy. Moreover, the propaganda extended its effects beyond Anne herself, affecting the perception of her daughter Elizabeth, whose legitimacy and social status were questioned immediately after consolidating the message that the king's authority could redefine not only life, but also the memory and future of individuals. The manipulation of public opinion turned Anne Boleyn's death into an event of social, political, and moral instruction, a carefully orchestrated spectacle that served both to justify the monarch's actions and to reinforce his absolute power, demonstrating that, in the Tudor context, controlling the narrative could be as effective as controlling the. Ultimately, Anne's execution and the accompanying propaganda reveal how public perception can be deliberately shaped, erasing human nuances and transforming personal tragedies into instruments of politics and social. Despite Henry VIII's efforts to erase Anne Boleyn from history, her life and death have endured, becoming a complex legacy that goes far beyond personal tragedy. The king sought to eliminate not only the queen, but also her memory. He ordered the destruction of portraits, the erasure of emblems, the public discrediting of her action, and the declaration of her daughter Elizabeth as illegitimate, creating an official narrative that painted Anne as a traitor and adulteress. However, history has shown that these attempts at total control could not completely suppress the truth, and over the centuries, Anne became a symbol of absolute political power, female vulnerability in patriarchal societies, and the dangers of manipulating information and public perception. Her story resonates as a warning about how authority can distort facts, reshape narratives, and erase individuals from collective memory, demonstrating that those in power have the ability to rewrite realities to justify actions and consolidate control. At the same time, the survival of records, letters, testimonies, and later studies has allowed historians to reconstruct not only the events of her life, but also the psychological and political dimensions of her downfall, revealing layers of suffering, strategy, and resistance that were obscured by Tudor propaganda. Anne Boleyn's narrative is more than the story of an execution. It is a lesson on how gender, power, and politics intertwine, showing that women in positions of influence were often targeted by systematic campaigns to erase their voices. And modern historical revision allows us to see Anne not merely as a victim, but as the protagonist of her own story, someone whose intelligence, courage, and resilience in the face of extreme injustice continue to inspire and fascinate. Her execution, which at the time seemed to end her life and presence, in fact marked the beginning of a process of reflection and reinterpretation that would span centuries, transforming her death into a study of power abuse, narrative control, and the difficulty of completely silencing a human story. Anne Boleyn thus became a timeless symbol of resistance against tyranny, and her story is remembered not only for the drama of her execution, but for the way her legacy survived, revealing truths about injustice, manipulation, and the strength of historical memory. Even Henry VIII's efforts to erase her failed, proving that no matter how much authorities try to control perception and distort reality, certain stories possess the power to endure and teach profound lessons about humanity, courage, and the fragility of truth in the face of absolute power. Despite all of Henry VIII's efforts to erase Anne Boleyn from history, her life and death have endured, becoming a powerful and lasting legacy that goes far beyond personal tragedy. The king sought to eliminate not only the queen, but also her memory, ordering the destruction of portraits, the removal of royal emblems, public defamation, and the declaration of his daughter Elizabeth as illegitimate, creating an official narrative that portrayed Anne as a traitor, adulteress, and conspirator. However, history has shown that such attempts at absolute control could not completely suppress the truth, and Anne emerged as a symbol of resistance, intelligence, and courage in the face of tyranny. Her life and execution offer a clear lesson on how absolute power can manipulate perceptions, distort facts, and erase legacies, but also on how historical memory and documentation can restore what was attempted to be destroyed. Over the centuries, historians have reconstructed not only the events of her life, but also the psychological and political dimensions of her downfall, revealing the suffering, courage, and cunning that were overshadowed by Tudor propaganda. Anne Boleyn's story resonates as a warning about the intersection of power, gender, and politics, showing that women in positions of influence were frequent targets of campaigns to destroy reputations, where public defamation and narrative manipulation were used to consolidate. By revisiting her life and death, we understand that the execution was not merely physical, but an act of attempting to erase her identity and legacy entirely, and that official propaganda and censorship were intended to shape public perception to justify political decision. Yet, the survival of accounts, letters, official records, and modern historical research has allowed her true story to be reconstructed, transforming Anne into a symbol of resilience and a figure who teaches us about the fragility of truth in the face of absolute. Her legacy, therefore, transcends the execution itself. It reveals how the manipulation of power can distort memory and facts, but also how truth, even silenced for centuries, can emerge forcefully, offering timeless lessons on courage, injustice, and resistance. Anne Boleyn's story continues to fascinate and inspire, reminding us that despite attempts at erasure, certain voices and experiences have the power to survive, challenge distortion, and become critical references on the dynamics of power, gender, and manipulation that remain relevant today. A story that reveals that the death of a queen was not just an act of physical violence, but a calculated spectacle of psychological terror, public humiliation, and historical manipulation. If you were impressed by what you discovered, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and leave a like, because your subscription helps YouTube understand that you want to see more fascinating and revealing content allowing the channel to continue growing and bringing stories that challenge what you think you know about the past. For those who can support even further, there is the Super Thanks option, which helps us invest in even deeper research and more complete content. And if you can't, that's okay. Leave a comment about what surprised you most in this video, because we want to know your opinion and reflections and story. Before you go, I strongly recommend clicking to watch the video appearing on the screen now, because it is even more interesting and captivating, bringing more mysteries, shocking revelations, and stories that will grab your attention from start to finish. Don't miss it.